Torah as a whole is wisdom, and there is the spirit of the Torah that applies to all of us every day in every way. But the letter or the specifics of those commandments do not apply to every individual. For example, there are commandments for Jewish people, and then there are commandments for non-Jewish people. And non-Jews have never had to keep the Torah in the way that it was incumbent upon Israel and the Jewish people. As we'll talk more about, there's an invitation for the nations, not an obligation.
Today we are discussing a massive topic. So I want to actually start by giving a little disclaimer for everyone watching, and that there's no way we're going to exhaust this topic today. That's for sure. But even though we can't be exhaustive, this is really a crucial topic that I'm just going to say we just need to keep discussing. Of course, we're talking about the topic of Torah for disciples. So let's begin with, I would say, a fundamental and critical question that I think really sets the table for our discussion today. And that is, did Yeshua, Jesus, did he do away with or cancel the Torah?
The short answer of that is no.
No, okay.
Okay, Yeshua says in Matthew chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount, he said, I did not come to abolish the Torah, but to fulfill it. And I think there's all sorts of debate on exactly what that meant, but it's very clear from the life of Yeshua and the life of the disciples in the book of Acts that they did not just abandon the Torah. For example, in Peter's vision of the sheep that comes out of heaven with the unclean animals, Peter says, this is in the book of Acts, he says, I have never eaten anything unclean, when God tells him to arise and eat. And even there, he's not literally being called to arise and eat something that's unclean. He's talking about Gentiles or not unclean, and he's to go to Cornelius's house. So I think that there's this, in Western tradition, there's this unhealthy emphasis and this dichotomy that's created coming out of law and gospel.
Yeah.
And so this idea of law is bad, old, outdated, replaced, gospel is good, and it's a blessing, and it's for us today. And I just think this is a false dichotomy that's made. First of all, Torah doesn't actually mean law. Torah actually comes from the Hebrew word which means instruction. Torah is actually wisdom. It's wisdom of God, so how we can walk out his word and his will for our life. And really, when God gives the Torah to Israel at Mount Sinai, he says to them, you'll be a mamlechet kohanim and a goy kadosh, a holy priesthood and a royal nation. And this is how Israel was to walk out their covenantal calling, identity, and destiny. One more verse. Yeah. The apostle and Rabbi Paul writes, all scripture is God-breathed, profitable for teaching, rebuke, restoration, training in righteousness. At that time, Paul wrote, there is no New Testament.
Yeah.
He's only talking about the Hebrew scriptures at that time. So clearly the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah, which is the foundation of it, always remain significant to Yeshua and the disciples. Even James says, look how many have believed, Jews have believed, and they're zealous for the Torah. This is in the book of Acts, many years after Yeshua died and commissioned the disciples.
Yeah, I think actually in that same chapter in Acts 21, James talks about, he says, Paul, you walk orderly, keeping the Torah. So again, this is some of these popular conceptions of the law being done away with, canceled, however it's put. They need to be challenged a little bit, and that's what we're talking about today.
And I think this is rooted in replacement theology. This idea, if God is done with Israel, then clearly God is done with the Torah of Israel. And I think one of the reasons why, and it makes sense, one of the reasons why people go down this route is because what I see happens is that oftentimes when people read the New Testament, especially the epistles, they tend to read it in a way that's very general. They forget that Paul is writing to specific communities dealing with specific issues. So when Paul writes something like the book of Galatians, and that's or the book of Romans, and those are really the two main books people use to say that there's no significance for the Torah or that it's bad or negative in some way. They forget that Galatians is written to a group of predominantly Gentiles or maybe completely Gentiles, and there's people who are teaching that Gentiles need to keep the Torah in order to be saved. So Paul is dealing with this heresy. We'll get into this more in a moment. But you don't need to keep the Torah to be saved. And that's why Paul is making this argument. He's not talking about it in general. But if you read the Bible universally and not the context in which those epistles are being written, you can come up with a doctrine or beliefs that are off, such as the Torah is bad, the gospel's good, and let's just get rid of it.
Okay, so you led right where I wanted to go next with this, because you and I both know very well that a lot of times when we start talking about Torah for disciples, some people start to get uncomfortable. The discomfort comes in regarding salvation. And so here's the big question. If Yeshua did not do away with the Torah, does that mean that we need to keep the Torah to be saved? So that's what people frequently think. How do you answer that?
As the great rabbi and apostle Paul said, by no means.
By no means.
So just to be clear, you do not need to keep the Torah to be saved. Now, I also want to be clear that salvation, not even in the Hebrew scriptures or in the Torah, has ever been the means of salvation. And this is the point of Hebrews 11. It goes back to creation itself, that it's always been by faith. Talks about even Cain and Abel, okay? It's always been by faith. It's never been any other way. Genesis chapter 15, Abraham believed, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Faith has always been the foundation and the way we access the gift of salvation, but faith requires faithfulness. And so we need to walk out our faith in very tangible, very real sort of way. And I think that's what is the significance of what we're talking about here. In the same way, people have raised a theological question. Do you need to be baptized in order to be saved?
Good analogy.
It's called baptismal regeneration. Some people believe that unless a baby is baptized or an adult is baptized, you cannot go to heaven. Okay? Well, I don't think that's biblical. What I'm saying is that baptism, like circumcision, like the keeping of the commandments, are an outward sign of an inward reality of our faithfulness to God. So we honor God's commandments not to be saved. We honor God's commandments because of what he did in our life. We see this even in the 10 Commandments. It begins with, I am the Lord your God who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. It doesn't begin with creation. It begins with redemption. God is saying, now that I've given you this gift of redemption, now walk out my word, walk out my ways, walk out my commandments.
But here's another question that we do hear a lot. And that is, if disciples are to keep the Torah on some level, does that mean that we should be offering sacrifices today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the first thing when we're looking at God's commandments is that we need to say, first of all, which one of those commandments apply to me? The Torah as a whole is wisdom, and there is the spirit of the Torah that applies to all of us every day in every way, but the letter or the specifics of those commandments do not apply to every individual. For example, there are commandments for Jewish people, and then there are commandments for non-Jewish people. And non-Jews have never had to keep the Torah in the way that it was incumbent upon Israel and the Jewish people. As we'll talk more about, there's an invitation for the nations, not an obligation. And so that's an important point to be able to make. So when it comes to the sacrifices, right, there's commandments that can only be fulfilled, for example, when you're in the land of Israel. Technically, tithing only applies when you're in the land of Israel. of the offerings of the land, or the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year, or the sabbatical year only applies in the land of Israel. And in the same way, there are certain commandments that can only be fulfilled under certain conditions. There can't be sacrifices today, nor should there be, because there's not a temple in Jerusalem. That's the only place that sacrifices could be offered, and so it's not even possible today. But ultimately, we know Yeshua is our final sacrifice, and so I think what's important too is to understand that some people say the Torah has been changed or done away with. I prefer to say it's not that the Torah has changed, but our relation to the Torah has changed because we have been changed by Yeshua.